Hello, everybody. Welcome to Covendom. This is a weekly web show from an Alexandrian perspective where we explore all kinds of different facets of the occult. My name is Levi Rowland, and this is my fabulous co-host, Brian Cain, and we are coming to you live from the French Quarter here in New Orleans at the wonderful Hex. And this is our 6th episode?
I
don't remember.
6 or 7.
This is 6.
I think it's 6.
It's 6. So today's
6 or 7.
6.
Let's look later.
And today's topic is the mythology of witchcraft. And we're not talking about classical mythology today. That might come up. But we're talking about medieval witchcraft, Renaissance witchcraft, trial records, sort of the whole mythology of Margaret Murray and everything that we think about the witch cult. And we're going to go into detail about our history, what makes us us, what we pull from, what we believe, what we don't believe, and, you know, what we think about it.
So why don't we start with you pulling the weekly card?
Yes. So I brought a very weird deck today. It's called the Parrot Tarot, but 2 T's at the end. I don't know if there you go. It's got a very interesting backing. This was the first tarot deck I ever bought. I bought it in a magic trick shop in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, and I lost it, and I found it online again. It's a rare deck, and it's not named after parrots, the birds, although they are in there, but after the person who designed it.
They're very unique. Did you show them?
They are. If you look at the artwork, it's all hand-drawn, and it has all the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn correspondences on it, and things like that.
It kind of has that old circus look to it.
And it's got like a circus kind of feel, it does. So I'm going to give the deck a good shuffle. You can give it a cut and a knock. We always like the knocks. It's a very weird back, too. It's like Kabbalah and Taoism and everything. So, the Prince of Discs. So in this desk, this would be the Knight of Pentacles, right? So mounted, nude, horned god. Very nice for what we're talking about today. But
and wealthy.
Yeah, wealthy. I consider this usually a wealthy benefactor, a workman, somebody who's committed to the work, down to earth.
Young, attractive, and wealthy. All my favorite things.
I know.
Oh, right? And male.
Yeah, even better. Element of Earth, Aries to Taurus. You know, it's a very grounded card, so it should be good today.
Yay!
Yay!
Show and
Good
tell.
card.
So let me go first. So I was actually going to bring something else, but I thought that I discovered this book actually just like this last year.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's The Roots of Witchcraft by Michael Harrison. I thought it's a great book for this topic because I really like how it sort of draws upon the mythologies that we're going to be speaking upon, but it also compares it to some of the practices that we actually use today. And he actually analyzes certain barbarous words and certain rituals and things like that and sort of finds possible historic resources for them. So I think it's a really good book that every witch should have on their bookshelf. Yeah.
Fantastic. So I brought a book as well. Sorry, I was just checking. Apparently there is some buffering on YouTube. Sorry about that, but it should catch up in time. So I brought a book as well. When we're talking about historical witchcraft, there's not a lot of scholars that I really love because most scholars of historical witchcraft are coming at it from a very secular, often Marxist sort of perspective about the history of misogyny and the witch trials as sort of abuses of the poor and abuses of women, which was very much part of it too. But very few people really tackle the religious aspect of it, and Carlo Ginzburg is my absolute favorite scholar on this. This is the book called Ecstasies, Deciphering the Witch's Sabbath, where he looks at it from the perspective of religious faith and shamanism in Europe. You also get this with people like Emma Wilby, who wrote Witchcraft as Shamanism and also did, in my opinion, the best translation of Isabel Gaudi's trial records. But it's just a really fantastic book. There is a lot of postmodern jargon in the intro, so you know, if you can get through that. But the actual book itself is fascinating. It goes into the worship of Diana, into the worship of figures like Herodias from the Bible, as sort of anti-Christian, pagan leftover rebellions in a very cool way. And it really digs into the Episcopal writings of the time, like the writings of bishops and whatnot. So, fantastic book.
Yeah, that was... you might have been the one that recommended it to me at the time, but that book was really an important piece of research for some of my book.
It's a great one.
All right, so talking about our show, what we're doing today, the mythology of witchcraft. So the reason why I think that this is very important is because as modern witches, you know, our history is so vast. We've got the modern history, you know, the factual things that happened now within our lifetimes, within a few generations. We have this huge gap of mythology that we're going to look at today. And then we have the the old world that predated Christianity. And when you weave these things all together, there's actually just so many fabulous, delicious, juicy little eye-opening moments that you have.
Yes.
And I think it's extremely important. So I think that when we first came onto the scene as modern witches, we really looked at, Reginald Scott and Margaret Murray and these different authors who were kind of trying to review that mythology or that period of witchcraft within Christianity from different angles. And it was really kind of explored. And I think we dropped that for a long time, in lieu of trying to just look at the old world.
Agreed.
I think that there's a recent revival in trying to look at that mythology again. And I think that, people like Carl Ginsberg coming forward and kind of, taking some of those older ideas and giving them a fresh perspective.
Yes.
So there's a lot more. There's a lot more material out there now. A lot more discoveries. A lot more. It's kind of like what we know about Stonehenge now greatly exceeds what we knew about it in the 70s.
Yeah,
I think they still thought the Druids
they did. They
built
still
it in the 70s. And here we are, fast forward not that long, and we know a great deal more. So I think it's important to sort of relook at these things, as well as some people are looking at works like Margaret Murray's and saying, well, yes, it's fundamentally flawed, but she had a lot more going for her than this movement was saying at one point in
Agreed.
time. So there are a lot of people re-looking at some of her work and saying, well, yes, the overall hypothesis is greatly flawed, but there's still valuable material in here, which I've always believed.
I agree.
Depending on, if we re-articulated her message, it would have more credibility than, and if she took the bit about Joan of Arc out.
Yeah, there's a little bit there that's like...
there's too much fantasy, but there's a hypothesis there. And that hypothesis really was that when Christianity was coming out and calling people witches across Europe, sometimes they may have been speaking about something invented in their minds, or hysteria, paranoia. But sometimes there was a basis behind it, and it was usually some form of pre-Christian religion. I do believe that it's extremely unlikely and extremely illogical to believe, based on what we could look at in modern history, that the church waved its wand and said, we're all now officially Christian, and everybody immediately fell in line.
No.
I believe that's how most people record it. It was the end of
once they convert,
of this,
we're
and
done.
then everyone converted. I guess it took hundreds and maybe even thousands of years, in a sense, to get to where we are now. And even in the present day, you look at places, like Wales, Cornwall, Scotland, places throughout the world, Krampus festivals in Germany. There are remnants of pagan festivals that never died out completely. So if those things can survive to the present day, what was it like 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 300 years ago?
Absolutely.
It slowly faded over time. And the reason why we have this wealth of information is because it didn't all get erased. But what we're also going to be looking at today is what the church recorded, and what we think might be accurate and what we think might be completely made up.
Yep.
Or what the origins of that was. So you go.
I think my intro is one of the things I really want to focus on is there is a big difference between, since we called this show Mythology of Witchcraft, I thought it was important to bring home this idea that there is a massive difference between the word myth and the word lie. They are not synonyms. They are used as synonyms nowadays. When we say 7 myths about the keto diet or whatever when you're online, that's...
Oh, sorry, everyone.
Look at this one right here.
I was trying to make sure it was going through all right.
Right here.
Somebody said it was buffering, so I wanted to see.
I checked too.
It's going through.
Anyway.
Where's that noise coming from?
Myth is not a synonym for lie. So when we talk about a myth, a mythos, we're talking about something that has power behind it. So the witch's sabbat as an image lived as a reality for people. So we might nitpick whether or not we think they were really doing X, Y, or Z, but we know that there is a reality to it that is mythic, that is in the old sense of that word. So when we draw from that, we are not saying it's a lie that they went out and worshipped this particular deity or this particular thing. we are drawing from an egregore, from a spiritual tradition, from an image, from an artwork, the woodcuts, the paintings, all of that beauty, the sort of folklores and the rhymes and the dancing and the chants and whatnot. And that is real. And so is it mythic? Yes, but it's mythic in the same way that lots of truths that we really believe in are mythic. So there's a difference there. So don't think of it as that's a myth as being that's a lie. It's not. There's a huge difference between literal truth and spiritual truth. And we are a spiritual tradition. So I think that we can pull from that without necessarily ceding any ground to this very nitpicky, minutia-oriented view of history.
Well, they say history is written by the conquerors.
Yeah.
That certainly is true when it comes to Christianity and other religions. I'm glad you said something, though, that sort of, I may be taking a bit off track, but you spoke about art.
Yes.
And I think this is a huge piece that we really miss out on when speaking about the history of witchcraft, is that alongside these trial records and, other pieces of information we have, art has survived within various sources depicting what witches looked like, what a witch's sabbat looked like. And it gives us a whole different context to look at what people were thinking in their minds. They were not drawing witches as crones flying on brooms all the time. Sometimes they were beautiful. It often comes out that Gerald Gardner invented the idea of nudity, and then other people will say he got it from Leland's work. And that British witches wouldn't have been nude. However, art tells a different story. There's nude witches in British art. There's nude witches in Italian art. It certainly wasn't a all the time thing, but it happened enough to where this idea of nude witches was happening in the medieval period.
Again, it becomes that mythic egregore.
Why did they think witches were nude? Was it just because it was...
Not to interrupt you at all, but for our viewers, there is some issues on buffering on YouTube, but on the Facebook, I've got it live and people are commenting as well. It's much better. So if you go to the Covendom page on Facebook, the chat's going great. We're getting good questions and whatnot, and it seems to be just a little bit smoother.
Now, even though it's buffering on YouTube later, it'll be there. Fine there. All right. So that's just YouTube, probably. It happens sometimes, obviously.
Yeah, but we're getting great comments on that it's going great on Facebook.
So what are some of the things that you think, what are some things that you think are valuable about researching trial records for modern practitioners?
So much. I went through a phase where this was my biggest obsession. I could recommend so many books here besides just Carlo Ginzburg. Peters has a wonderful edited book called Witchcraft in Europe. There's also Brian Levick's Witchcraft Source book. Ava Pox, if I'm pronouncing her last name right, Hungarian scholar, Between the Living and the Dead is her book. So I think what we draw from it the most is that this is a tradition. Like, there is a history of this. And you begin to pull these amazing images from it, such as put yourself in the mindset of somebody in 15th century England or 14th century Germany, right? You're confused, you're scared, the church is not helping you with something, and there's this mythology that you've grown up with, whether it's the Fae in the Celtic lands or whether it's the whites or whatever, or the spirits, and your family's kept that alive, and the church really doesn't like it, but they also kind of let it go sometimes. And there's this outlet, and it's in the woods, or it's in some secret family, kept tradition of feeding the sprites or whatever. That's something we can pull from very powerfully to see ourselves as the other, right? As liminal, as existing on a path that is separate from the mundane, that is separate from the mainstream, that is, different. And I think that rebellion, not a cheap rebellion, not a sort of childish rebellion, but a rebellion against the norm, is something we pull from the trial records very powerfully. And I think the other thing that we pull from it is that the things that we hold dear, like goddess worship, the divine feminine, sexual liberation, all of these things are very important to us, never died. The church tried, but it couldn't. And so we pull that from it, that there is a survival of it in some way, and I really like that.
If you go to certain... Traveling is the best way you can really open your eyes about some of these things. I don't know about you, but when we traveled around Greece and went to the different sites, I think one of the reasons why I liked Eleusis so much is I got the distinct feeling that even the, what they call them, guardians, the people that sat there with their whistles, I think they call them guardians.
Yeah, the guards.
They were even different to Eleusis. There were actual offerings left in Olympus that were new. They'd been, the locals were still coming there. Yeah. It was quite clear that something was still going bump in the night there. In any other of the sites, if you touched something or got too close, they'd blow the whistles. They'd be very angry. And I remember kneeling down because I was at the temple of Diana, and I couldn't help myself. I touched one of the stones, but I was on my knees, and I feel when someone's looking at you. There was a guardian staring right at me, and I looked at her, and she just smiled. Yeah, because I believe she knew I was. I believe she knew I was being devoted. I wasn't just being a messy tourist. You got that feeling that was still going on. Go to Ireland. You've still got these fairy trees and these grottos and these wells full of current offerings and things that are, we went to Wayland Smithy in Wales, and that place was being worked. The offerings there was near Lammas, and they were Lammas offerings. They were not tourist offerings. There were corn dollies and different things. So this stuff is alive and well today, and it's not all, it's sometimes it's localized practices that have nothing to do with somebody who's been initiated into a witch cult. They're just people who are carrying on customs that mean something to them. There's an old thing called giving due providence. I don't know the actual source for it. I've read about it for years, but it was the idea that someone could practice pre-Christian beliefs as long as their butt was in the seat on Sunday. Yeah. And that they would actually, if they were a farmer, they would, give their due to the spirits of the harvest because they didn't want to upset them and have a bad crop, but they still were worshipping Christ and the Christian God. And they didn't see this as being at conflict. Everything had its own dominion. Jesus was concerned with their souls, not with their harvest. Yep. Exactly. So they had to go somewhere that was concerned with their harvest.
I think also one of the things why the Christian church got so obsessive about punishing certain practices as superstitious and the sort of witch trials was they were terrified of the fact that they were being pagans in a way, and they had to make a stand. So, when people came out and said, oh, you're not pagan, but you have a goddess who stands on the moon and is crowned in stars, and you call the mother of God and the queen of heaven, yeah, that's heathen, that's old. And they were,
or the Protestants called them out.
Exactly. Or the saints, this cult of the saints, which has been diminished excessively in modern, particularly American Catholicism. But if you read medieval Catholicism, Jesus was low on the list for a lot of people of who you went to. It was a litany of saints and incarnations.
He was for saving your soul. He wasn't for everything else.
I think that's one of the reasons the church was so aggressive in certain aspects, is they could smell that they themselves were keeping alive older traditions. I mean, the Virgin Mary is a goddess. There is a very complicated Catholic theology that I am well versed in about hyperdulia and whatnot being different than dulia. It's all about the different types of worship that are due God versus a saint. It's all BS. To the average Catholic, I've been in the Mass way too many times. When they pray to the Virgin Mary and they say things like, Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, and our hope, it's a goddess. It just is. When you watch them kissing the statues at Fatima in Portugal, or when you watch them kissing the statues or the ground at Guadalupe in Mexico, it's a goddess. And they can say it's not all they want, and they can have this lovely, complex Aristotelian theology. It doesn't matter.
Go to Kildare, Ireland.
Exactly.
Go to Ireland.
She's a goddess, right?
Ireland is the most, and I haven't been around the whole world, but Ireland is the most female divine place I have been to, because when you go through that Ireland, and we traveled through most of Ireland, you almost never saw a Jesus statue.
It's all Mary.
The only male statue I ever saw was St. Patrick, and that was once. It was all Mary, or it was all Brigid. Mostly Mary everywhere. And Mary never had baby Jesus in her hands.
Just her, right?
Just Mary.
Queen of the heavens, right?
I thought that was very interesting. And when you go to Kildare, which was the center for Brigid's worship, and Brigid's all over the island anyway, she's in the middle of the town square, a statue of her, a modern statue, and there's no Christian iconography. She's holding fire. It's a woman with no cross, no anything. She's holding fire, and you've got the Brigid crosses around the town, but she's still there. They know it. Talking to one of our guides in Crete, we were talking about the Greek Orthodox Church and Greek, pre-Christian religion, and he made a comment as almost sort of a joke. He was Greek Orthodox. He said, everyone here is Greek Orthodox. Yeah. But we were talking about Zeus, and, I said, is there anyone who worships Zeus anymore? He said, well, we all do. He's still God, isn't he?
Exactly, right?
Yeah. He was basically saying, well, we know that this Christian God is also still Zeus to us.
But the thing is also, the Christians admitted this. If you read the early church fathers, they knew. And they'll say things like in St. Augustine and whatnot, that the pagans were preparing the road for Christ. So when anti-Christian writers like Julian the Emperor and people would attack Christianity and be like, look, you just stole this, like, point blank from the mystery cults or whatever, the Christians would respond, well, yes, but that's just because the road was being prepared. So they even saw it. They knew that a dying God who is born again and is the child of the sun or whatever, and a goddess, who is his divine mother, is an old story. They weren't stupid. A lot of them were, St. Augustine was incredibly educated. And so was Origen and all the other church fathers. They knew. And so they tried to make excuses for it, when in reality, they just stole it. I mean, if you go to Rome, which you're going soon, the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore, which means the Church of Mary the Great, is built on the ruins of the Temple of Magna Mater, the Great Mother, right? It's very obvious. The Pantheon is a pagan temple converted into a church. And there's lots of these. They did it to the temple of, they were going to do it to Artemis's temple in Ephesus, right? Until a Christian burned it down. So they knew. They knew what they did. And I think later they tried to undo that realization, but it didn't work.
One of the churches we're going to visit, I keep saying it wrong, I think it's called, it's not the Parthenon, but it's the
Pantheon.
Pantheon, thank you.
Pantheon in Rome, yeah.
It is the remnants of Hadrian's temple that the circular dome's still there, and it had all of the gods of Rome, the state gods of Rome around this dome. Well, now it's saints.
Yeah.
The only reason it survived is because they turned it into a church.
Which
if
they
would not have turned it into a church, it would have been destroyed. So thankful for that. We thank the Catholic Church for preserving so much paganism. In fact, I have a statue in my home of Serapis that is from the Vatican.
Yeah.
If it wasn't in the Vatican, I wouldn't have it in my home.
No, they would have destroyed it.
To pray to.
In our evil
Let's get
ways.
to little nitty-gritty. You owe me a question, but if any of you have questions,
yes, please.
Or if you'd like to be a call-in guest, it's a video call-in, you can. If you do call in, please have 2 questions prepared at your limit, or one or 2 questions. I'll keep it to that and we'll boot you off.
So generous.
However, if you've got questions you want to post in the script, we'll gladly answer them. But let's get into the nitty-gritty of witchcraft mythology in the medieval era. What are we talking about?
What do we mean by that?
What is the thing? Do you have a question for me?
Well, what I want to ask you is what images from that time period, as an initiate, as a member of an initiatory craft now, do you believe are some of the most important ones we should preserve? Like, what from the Sabbath tradition do we want to keep? What images, what power, what egregore, what is beautiful about it that we need right now?
An interesting point that was made by one of our coven mates, Mr. Chapele, actually, I thought it was very brilliant. If you were a medieval Christian, Catholic, whatever, and you went into the forest and you saw a group of Gardnerians and you watched their ritual, even half of it, or you saw a group of Alexandrians, you watched their ritual, even half of it, you would instantaneously know they were witches.
Yeah, and you try to kill them.
There would be no question, you would be like, what is this? I think that there obviously are some similarities. Gerald Gardner got initiated in the New Forest Coven, and he was already an occultist. The New Forest Coven, we don't know their actual origins, but we know that many of the members were also occultists. Margaret Murray and Reginald Scott's books were out, as well as Leland's already. So there was already material out suggesting a witch cult survival within Christian Europe. And I do believe there was not a overarching witch cult survival. I think there were witch cults in pockets, in places. And I think that kept the story going. I think that's the truth behind the story, is that you would have localized cults still going. And I think a lot of these cults probably had similarity because they descended from the mystery cults, whether they knew it anymore or not. Some of them may have been cults that popped up because of the witchcraft mythology. There was enough information. They were like, okay, if we go into the woods and call the devil.
I think that's a big thing. It's like self-fulfilling.
Yeah, right? I think that also
the church
probably
created
happened.
it.
But I do believe that, and I believe there's evidence that, especially early on in the early, era we're talking about of Christianity, that there were still strong mystery cult presences in certain places. I absolutely believe that. Yeah. And I do believe there's evidence, which we could get to. But to answer your question, obviously the horned gaunt, working nude, working magic, flagellation, dancing, the circle, knives, wands, sex, sexuality,
dualism.
The goddess, although that's obscured later on, early on it's not. I think a lot of it is matching that. The difference is we have explanations. We're saying, oh, that horned figure that you saw, the witch is dancing around, well, that was actually a priest, and he's wearing the horns, symbolizing the horned god, etc., etc., etc. Looks demonic. And there are woodcuts of witches dancing with horned demons. You've got the female witches alternating with horned demons. Well, interestingly enough, in the cult of Dionysus, most of the priests in that cult dressed as satyrs.
Yeah, and they call him the horned god.
So literally. If that custom carried on somewhere, that would explain why people understood about it. Or the story was passed. Oh, your grandfather went to, who knows? We don't know all of these things. But I think the imagery is there. The question is, was it something that we grafted off of Murray's work? I think a lot of people think it was. Where did the New Forest get their information? The reality of the situation is there's an extreme amount of evidence that, the oldest festival in Ireland is called the Puck Fair in Kilkenny. I'm not saying it's oldest in the sense that it predates the ancient Druid festivals. It's the oldest modern festival that still has continuation they do not know the origins of. Some people think it was of medieval antiquity. Some people think it was pagan. But the custom is they go up into the mountains, they find a goat, they bring him back down to the village, and they crown him the Puck King, and they put him in this big thing, and they kind of worship him like a god and have this huge fair. And at the end, they re-release him into the mountains, supposedly. So we don't really know that was the goat. But what are the origins of this? Puck is an English fairy, Robin Goodfellow, associated with witchcraft, probably connected to Pan, but in Ireland it would have been connected to Puka, which was probably originally a god. Did he have horns? It depends on the story. Some people identify it as a horse spirit, but in any case,
the black horse.
For whatever reason, someone said it was a goat, and that's the practice that's still going on today and has been for hundreds of years in Kilkenny. Is that they get the Puck King every year, and if it was pre-English, then it probably was Puka, and they adapted Puck in its place. But it could be something brought over by English-speaking people and grafted to local custom. We don't really know. The point of it is, if you were taking this into paranoid medieval England and you went into this village and they had a goat sitting up on a throne, and they're all dancing and having a great time.
Come on.
You're going to say, and what are the trials saying? The devil appeared as a goat quite often.
Always, yeah.
That's the devil up there. They're worshipping the devil in the form of a goat.
Yep.
The fact is,
just the average Wednesday.
This was happening. There were people that were using this imagery. So,
Yeah. We do have a question that I think is important. Do you think, this is Shelley's question, do you think that sexuality played a big part in the persecution of witches?
Well, here's the thing. I think sexuality was being persecuted anyway.
Agreed.
So, I mean, the church didn't like sexuality, certainly didn't want women to be sexualized. You're only supposed to have sex when you're married, and there were rules, and, depending on which church you're in, but Catholics, very strict rules about when you couldn't. Very controlled. Priests couldn't have sex. There was a lot of things going on controlling sexuality, and certainly empowering women wasn't something that they wanted to do, but they didn't want to empower men sexually either. Obviously, we know people were still getting it on. That was still happening,
nature.
But it was a sin in most cases. Witchcraft is a fertility cult, being connected to agriculture, and witchcraft is a fertility cult being connected to the mysteries, is an opposing belief system. So if you want to go into the rural festivities of May, the clergy was certainly astute enough to understand that this had a sexual connotation.
Yeah.
So they probably weren't very fond of customs like going a Maying, and tried to stamp them out as quickly as possible. Witches having orgies.
Love it. Big fan.
Once again, who was having the orgies? Clearly they believed someone of a religious nature was having orgies, and they probably were.
Oh, two things. Camille's bringing up the FUCK being an acronym for fornication under Consider the King. It's actually a false etymology. It's not true. It's fun, though. No, it's just from the old Germanic word for intercourse. It's a vulgar word for intercourse. Actually, this is a total sidestep, but
Levi's a language teacher.
I know, as a language person, I have to tell you this. Most words that are considered vulgar were considered vulgar because they're literally what the meaning of the word vulgar is of the people. So the Latin word became okay, and the German or English word became vulgar. So, for example, the S word for using the bathroom is vulgar because it comes from Scheisse or whatever in German, whereas defecate was Latin, so it was okay. So that's actually where it comes from. Second of all, sexuality and witchcraft. I go back and forth on this. I do think that sexuality was a huge issue for why people were tortured or burned. And I do think it was very misogynistic. I think it was an obsession of a bunch of celibate priests. If you read their writings, it's almost masturbatory. It's just like they're all gathering in the woods and they're naked and they're rubbing their nakedness against each other. And you could tell it's just like, okay, Father, calm down a little bit. When's the last time it's very, very much repressed. I get that. But I do think that there is much too large a focus sometimes in certain historians' writings on this very narrow view of the witch trials as a persecution of sexuality or midwifery or whatever, as opposed to having a religious bent, which I do believe it did.
You also have to remember that the early church, even as a powerful machine, we're talking about, when there was popes, was closer to the mystery cults and the pagan world than they were to us, very early on.
Yeah.
So they remembered, they knew, they had the information. Rome was once filled with orgies. Pagan religion, as we'll call it, the mystery cults were very sexual in nature. And most pre-Christian people did not have a hang-up about sex. That's a Judeo-Christian thing. It just is. So
sometimes, yeah,
you've got an opposing philosophy going on there. I do think there were sects of Christians or mystic Christians that weren't.
Yeah.
But getting to the subject again, so if we're going to focus on orgies, what do you believe are possible legitimate sources for sexual festivals, outside of May Day? Sexual festivals are groups that might have been still doing things that go bump in the night.
This is where I do get skeptical, because there used to be a lot of history that we now know is not necessarily true about certain things. For example, the Babylonian belief, the belief that the Babylonians had the priestesses of Ishtar or whatever as sacred prostitutes, we now, through more, because I actually just learned this recently in a book I'm reading.
I thought that was only at Ephesus.
Well, we now know that it probably didn't happen at Ephesus.
Propaganda.
And it's propaganda. So because we are reading the history of many places through the eyes of Christians, they made stuff up. So the Cathars, for example, the heretics in southern France.
So you think they made it up? Yeah.
I do think they did. I don't think the
Cathars
were practicing.
There's some
orgies.
Propaganda going on.
Yeah.
What we're trying to get to the center of is, what do you think? There's two kinds of ideas here. Obviously, neither Levi nor I are prepared to say that we believe that there was a secret witch cult across Europe that, called themselves witches, that was this overarching religion that continues to today. I prefer saying witch cults. and they didn't all call themselves witch cults. I believe that they were cults. Some of them were rural, and some of them were communities that may not have been very well organized. I believe that any cult survival probably was among the wealthy, like as an actual mystery cult. In other words, if there were still groups meeting in Italy, worshipping the old gods and having orgies, they were probably doing it in a very confined palace.
Well, there's actually, I think, historical precedence for what you're saying. Near the end, first of all, this is something very important to remember. When Christianity started to explode in the Roman Empire, truly, we're not talking in the early days during the persecutions like Domitian and Diocletian and whatnot, but later, the wealthy preferred paganism. The poor preferred Christianity. So Brian's actually right. This mythology we have now that we got to get back to the roots and the woods and whatnot, because that was the original people who kept the faith alive. Wrong. The poor people loved Christianity. It was a liberatory religion. The rich kept it alive. For example, under the rule of, I think it was Valentinian, don't quote me on that, there was a very famous Roman noble named Praetextatus who restored the mystery cults from his own money. He was incredibly wealthy. Him and his rich friends kind of kept alive the cults at the very end of it, before the Constantinian era and before Theodosius ruined it all. Julian the Apostate, very wealthy. So Brian's right. It was not, the old mystery cults were kept alive by educated nobility, not by, the masses. Now, where it did stay alive in the masses was things like the cult of the Fae and the fairy faith in the Celtic lands and stuff like that, and folklore.
Cultural locations.
But they're very different.
So, interestingly enough, in some of this medieval storytelling that we have about the witchcraft myth, there was sometimes this idea that the witchcraft peasantry would occasionally be visited by someone of high status.
The queen, right?
Or a local
noble.
Lord or noble or something that was faithful to the old religion and would represent the god to them, but he wasn't normally among them. There's this sort of idea that I do believe that witchcraft survived in peasantry for a few reasons, but I think it was mostly in pocketed agricultural communities.
Yeah.
And I think it was more along the ways of you were doing something because it was good enough for your mother and your grandfather, and it wasn't necessarily,
kept the rats out of the larder, things like that.
Not necessarily considered an occult practice. One of the reasons why I believe that, it's factual that occultism came out of the wealthy. That it was the old original occult orders didn't allow poor people in. They just
very
didn't.
snobbish,
You had to be highly educated. We can tip our hat to Alex Sanders and Maxine, because originally the Gardnerians were preferable of the wealthy too. Alex and Maxine opened the doors to
lots of people.
It was the 60s and the 70s, so it was less snobbish as far as that's concerned.
They're part of a kind of.
That being said, I love wealthy people. You can all come join my coven.
Of course he does.
Jesus. I think that it's very curious, because you go to places like Christian and I were when we were in Ireland. There was this little man. Is it my imagination? I don't know. He was a milk farmer. His family had guarded this stone circle for generations. It was in their family's property for generations.
Yeah.
And he knew quite a lot about it. And a Christian, being Christian, said, "Have you ever had any witches work here?" And we've had sessions.
Sessions.
That word right there meant something to me, because he didn't want to get into it.
Yeah.
But it was kind of a nod. This was in the sticks, people. This was not in a city. And he loved Christian. I practically didn't exist. He was very fascinated with Christian. Christian gave him some money, though, so maybe that's fine. No, your imagination said, what was their family doing with this 200 years ago?
Yeah.
Because they'd been in his family for a really long time. So, and he allowed people to go onto it. But he had a hidden one on his property that he said, "Oh, would you like to see the secret one?" And it was all overgrown, and Asher does. Oh, it's right over there. I thought I was being sent off to be killed, because we had to kind of hike it up there. But your imagination takes hold, because we just really don't know.
That's part of the magic of it,
what's
though,
happening.
right? Is we're drawing from a sort of murky history.
And we don't know if there weren't covens in England before Gardiner and Alex. You know, the modern myth says that there were, and the New Forest Coven, if we believe it existed, and I do, I do believe it existed. I think there's enough evidence to say that it existed.
Yeah. So Heather on here was bringing up the whispering witches in Slavic tradition, how that was passed through peasant families, and then also agrees that a lot of the traditions were preserved by the wealthy. I think what I want to say here is yes, and what I think is very interesting about the modern witchcraft revival, and by that I mean Gardnerian and Alexandrian witchcraft specifically, is that this movement is a amalgamation of two things, and I think they work together beautifully. One of them is the folklore of traditional witchcraft, which is a horned god or a pagan goddess that had survived in the woods, gathering in a circle, chanting around a fire, raising power, worshiping something besides the Christian god, connecting to the earth, to fertility. We're drawing from that, absolutely. We are also drawing from the enormous Western occult tradition, Paracelsus, Agrippa, Neo-Pythagoreanism, Neoplatonism, Kabbalah, all of that. So I think one of the things I love about being Alexandrian, and also Gardnerians do this too, sometimes a little differently, but still very much so, is we are both. The modern trad movement, as it calls itself, usually only pulls from the former, and then you've got things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn that only pull from the latter, and I love that we are in the middle and we literally pull from both, and I think we harmonize them very well.
Well, we're looking at a long history, so it is kind of like, I've often said, where do you want to exist? I don't choose to exist. I don't choose to exist as the witch hiding in the woods, on the fringe of society, being afraid of being caught. That's not where I exist in my mind. That doesn't mean I've never played there. Doesn't mean that I don't recognize it. I exist in the grand, temples in my mind most of the time, because I want to elevate us into a new age. I don't want to try to make this a world religion, because I think it can't be. It is a mystery cult. And Levi said it's two things, and I say this by saying it's a fertility cult and a mystery tradition, or fertility cult and mystery priesthood. Because as a fertility cult, we're of the land, we're of the agriculture, we're of the people.
And
we have inherited that, Pan, Dionysus, the rural sort of thing as well. But at the same time, we can be in the temple of Astarte. We can be with Diana of Ephesus. We recognize this as all of a part of our history.
It's both.
We recognize it as both. And our magics are both the folk magic and the highly elevated magic as well.
You want both. I would be uncomfortable if either was stripped of me. And if we look at the history of witchcraft, I think it's also really important to realize that we're talking about something that has been really debated hotly in academia. And you really have two camps. And either you think there was something going on religiously against the church, or you think it is literally just a pogrom against women or against midwives or against whatever. I very much think that even though there was a lot of misogyny, there is such a strain of religiosity in it that I cannot buy into that other history that says that the witch trials is nothing but foolish hysteria or whatever. There's too many stories that correlate from different cultures. There's too much that correlates between it. And I think scholars like Ginsburg and whatnot realize that this is a holdover of older shamanistic, animistic beliefs.
When you've got people from across Europe saying the same things, you either have a lot of really programmed cultures, because you're talking about people that speak different languages, and they're saying the same things. People didn't read and write then. So it's not like the church distributed this book that the people in Germany read and the people in England read and the people in France read, but somehow there was a commonality going on here. And interestingly enough, if you take all the ideas of a witch's sabbat and you take all of the ideas of this mythology and this practice and you compare it to mystery cults, they're doing the same thing. Where did that come from? What's going on here? Something I think with this show would be very incomplete without addressing is what witches were worshipping.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, we all know that for the most part it was the devil. You know, the devil. And the devil had many titles, and we can get into some of those, great, you know.
Sure.
But what fascinates me is and something that people don't always realize, is that the church didn't use the devil originally. In fact, Diana was one of the main focal points for other folk names for her that said the witches were flying at night with Diana. And this is not from a trial record alone. This is actually an ecclesiastic church document.
The Episcopal canons, everything says this.
And they called Diana the last goddess of the pagans.
The Dea Paganorum. Yep.
Which to me indicates the possibility that they recognized that there was some sort of cult of continuation still going on there. Which also explains the reason why Mary all of a sudden got shucked out.
And why she's crowned in a moon and Queen of the Stars.
Been told that was done on the Festival of Diana originally.
And the thing about the Diana worship is Brian's right. The original, a lot of the trial records and a lot of the church documents they don't talk about the devil at all. Now,
early on.
No, they talk all the way through, they talk heavily about a woman. And one of the things, that she has very fascinating names. And one of the ones that I love that Carlos Ginsburg talks about a lot, is the Madonna Oriente, the woman from the East. You know, that's what they called her in a lot of places. The church refers to her in Latin as the Eastern woman that they worshipped. Well, I mean, what comes from the East? Astarte and Inanna and Diana and Isis, and that's all Oriental to the Western mind. So that fascinates me. And then you have the Queen of the Fae in Celtic cultures, which bears a striking resemblance to stories about Diana. So I firmly believe that people crave the divine feminine. And the church could give it to them in Mary, but the cult of Mary was not developed in the early days of the church as much as it was later.
No.
And it's a response.
And it is a belief,
to the
just like
cult.
the saints were often used to replace gods, that, you know, if you look at the iconography of Mary, it is either Diana or Isis. You know, all the sitting down, holding the baby Jesus that's you don't
Isis.
find that anywhere really much but Isis. I mean, there are a few other examples, but it's predominantly Isis that has that imagery. And then, you know, the moon and all that. That's Diana, obviously.
Crowned with
the
stars.
Romans had already conflated Diana and Isis at that time. You have to remember that Diana, and this is kind of to be to Heather's comment a little bit. I think it was Heather. Diana had a pre-Roman existence in Europe, and then she had the Roman existence in rural places, and then you had the state Diana.
They're all different.
By the time you have medieval Diana or late period Diana had begun to become conflated with Isis and the cult of Isis. Medieval Diana, by that time, and she already was anyway, she actually absorbed, Hecate, for instance, was absorbed by the Roman Diana.
Yep, and Selene and all.
Even though the Roman
Luna.
version was triune, there's also a triune Diana, or Diana triune.
Yes, there is.
Diana was really the one who absorbed
Triform.
Hecate in Rome. So if you're looking for a Roman version of Hecate, really it's Diana. You know, that's the character that took it. So when you talk about the wild hunt and flying at night with Diana, it is reminiscent of the spectral gatherings and things that
Agreed.
Hecate had.
So I want to take one question because it's something I was just researching. Dawn is asking, in the old days, was Lucifer considered a fallen angel? Let's be very clear about something. We need to, one thing, since we have talked about devil worship a little, we need to clear up something. In the Bible, there are lots of names for the adversarial figure to God. Traditional Jewish theology normally does not believe in some grand fall from heaven.
Accuser.
He's the accuser. He's Hasatan.
And it's Samuel.
Or Samael, right? Or Hasatan. He's the accuser. He's not a fallen angel. He's an accuser that works for God. In Christian mythology, you get Satan as the great tempter, still referred to as Satanas, you know, in Greek and Latin. You also get the word devil, which is much later, and it means little god. Then you get Lucifer. Lucifer is usually a translation of the morning star, of Venus, the planet Venus. It was a personification of the planet Venus. So to answer your question, it absolutely really depends on what period of history you're in, who you're reading. There is no unified theory of this devil figure. It really depends on where you are.
So, interestingly enough, if you don't mind me jumping on this a little bit, because I do write about it a little bit, you'll find when you study this sort of thing that you'll find many people saying Lucifer is a Roman sun god, which is not entirely untrue. There's actually even a place in the Vatican, you can look this up online, where they have a portrait of Lucifer. It's the Roman version, is Lucifer. Conspiracy theorists are like, this is what they're worshipping. Lucifer was also a name, or Lucifella, or not Lucifella, Lucifera, I don't know.
Well, Diana Lucifera.
Yeah.
Lucifera was one of the titles for any god that bore light. Helios.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Lucifer would have been associated with the dawn because of the planet Venus is seen in the morning. The first document that we really encounter in this in witchcraft is Charles Leland's Gospel of Aradia.
Yeah.
Whether you think this is a valid source or not, the god in that, the twin brother and lover of Diana in that book is Lucifer.
Mm-hmm.
Who is quite clearly being equated with her historical twin brother, Apollo.
Yeah.
Right?
The light bringer.
Which is, not going too far down the rabbit hole. In the book, Leland's book, there's some Christian stuff that comes up in there, like Lucifer falling from heaven, and Cain, and things like that, which to me actually lends credibility to the work, personally. But Ginsberg, I think it was, I don't know if it was this book or the other one, has some trial records in here where they talk about the games of Diana
the
and
Ludi Diana.
A male being present who they called Lucifello.
Yeah.
So this is another source of Diana being connected, trial records of Diana being connected with Lucifello or Lucifer. Now, a connection I found to be extremely interesting is in Leland's Gospel of Aradia. It talks about how Lucifer is the mouse and Diana is the cat that chases him through the heavens.
What is Apollo's sacred animal?
There are temples to Apollo where a white mouse was
He is literally called
sacred.
the mouse catcher in Greek,
Yes.
or the one with the mice.
I personally believe that Leland's Gospel of the Aradia is a real gem.
Yeah. So we've got a bunch of questions came through, and I want to make sure we get them. So Carrie asked, "What do you think of the books of Scott Cunningham when it comes to history and whatnot?" Because she was turned off by his book, she says, just quoting, no judgment. And now she's reading King of the Witches by June Johns and whatnot. And if we have any other personal books to recommend.
Well, Scott Cunningham's books are, I've hated them since I was 17 years old, and I still hate them.
Tell us what you really think.
I think he's one of the worst authors on witchcraft to have ever put ink to paper. Wow. And I think he's caused more damage through misinformation. He is a cultural appropriator in the worst way. He was never initiated, so hence why you've got this gentleman who started the whole campaign of "you don't need any of this." He didn't know what he was talking about, he didn't know what he was doing, and he basically lied and made a bunch of stuff up. He was close friends with Llewellyn, who was bitter because he was initiated by Lady Shiva, and then it turned out that she was full of crap. So, we've got some bitter biddies going on here. This is just a true history. I like Scott Cunningham's herbal books. I like his incense oils and brews and things like that. I think he was a magical man. I think that he inspired people on magical paths and, whatever gets you there. I know initiates who started out with Scott Cunningham books. But I instantly saw through that at a very young age, and, it's just because you go on and tell somebody, "Oh, you can be a Catholic and you don't have to be baptized," or "You can be Catholic and you never have to take Holy Communion," "You can be Catholic and you don't have to," no one should tell you to take confession. He didn't have a right to do that. He wasn't speaking from a place of authority.
Okay.
So I just don't really care for him.
Not a fan.
He was actually a Hawaiian shaman was his first thing, to be honest with you. Which says something of itself. As far as June Johns wrote that book primarily about Alex Sanders, and he wrote it, Alex did not write that book himself. So I think you've got to take some of the information in there with a grain of salt,
But it's a fun historical work.
I like the book, certainly the grandmother story was introduced to most people in that book, and we all know it's not entirely true. However, Alex Sanders did not write that book, so keep it in mind.
Yeah.
You know,
so
back then, publishers took great liberties.
Yes, they did.
And Alex was trying to promote publicity, so I think that I wasn't there, but I'd say take some of it with a grain of salt. But it's definitely a book everyone should read.
Okay, so a bunch of questions came through I want to hit on. So, do you work with the Fae? I'll answer this shortly. Yes and no. If you mean the Fae as in like the fairy faith, no. And I think it's because I don't live in the Celtic lands where it's very much alive. I've done Fae workings before personally, but I don't think it's not a central part of my practice. To me, the Fae are one of two things. This very weird mythology that springs up very late in fairy lore about they make contracts and deals and they're these crazy creatures. That's very late. If you read the original Fae lore, they're either the gods, they're either the Tuatha De Danann, who are forced underground and led by Munin and Muclir, or they're the pagan dead, right? Who are somehow in a limbo because they weren't Christian enough to go to heaven, but they're not bad enough to go to hell. You read that a lot in old, Celtic works. So to me, that's what they are. I don't think that they're these weird race of magical creatures that I can go work with.
Well, I actually do work with the She, and once you start working with them, you can't stop. That's the whole thing. Don't work with them unless. First of all, I think it's best if you work with them if you're related to them, and being related to them means you have some sort of Celtic DNA. And I'm not really into ancestral practices generally. Mm-hmm. However, I started working with the She very early on because my first formal witchcraft teacher was heavily into the Celtic fairy faith. Actually, one of her favorite books was the Celtic fairy faith or Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, or whatever it's called. I can't think of it by. If you start working with them and you forget to leave offerings for a long period of time, you'll start having a run of bad luck, and you'll realize, and you can always tell it's them because it really is done in a practical joke sort of way. How this started out, Levi's actually correct. The myth, it's best to look at it through the lens of Ireland because we have the best records of it. It started out, the myth is that the last king of the Tuatha De Danann, the Dagda, and Munin Muclir took what was left of them and went into the she-mounds of the other world. They divided the world of the gods from the world of men.
Because they lost the bet,
yes.
Remember?
Yes.
They got half of Ireland, and it was a trick. And they were the bottom half.
I think most of you know that there are these mounds throughout England, and we do know that they are burial mounds. Mm-hmm. So you've got to tie these two things together. You're talking about the Tuatha De Danann were presented as a race at one point in time. So you're talking about an ancient lost Celtic tribe, or a tribe that the Celts considered to be holy, divine, older than them, and started praying to and placating so that they wouldn't come out of the mounds. And so they were originally gods, a godlike race that through Christianity and what have you degenerated into something else.
Agreed.
Sometimes when people are talking about fairies, they're talking about elementals and nature spirits, which are not necessarily the same thing. Yeah. If you're working with the Celtic She, or the Celtic fairy, you are working with the pagan ancestral forces.
Yeah.
What makes them unique, in my mind, is the fact that, and I think we're a little off topic here, but they never knew Christianity, and they lived very close with nature, so they're very strange spirits. They're not, and they want to be honored. So if you start working with them, they're not a system you can walk away from if you really get involved. So that would be my only warning.
Yes. Yeah. So Heather had something to say that I completely agree with. She says, I wonder sometimes if the word devil, used by the Christians, was not more synonymous with devils in the plural and really meant demons or any negative spirits or entities in general. You're dead right. In the canon episcopi and whatnot, and in the writings of the church, the word that is used for devils came to mean any non-Christian spirit. They used this word to describe spirits of the dead. They used this word to describe pagan gods. They used this word to describe the she. So you're right. It came to be a catch-all.
However, getting back to the subject, please interject. When you're looking at the witchcraft mythology that sort of came out, the medieval mythology, at a certain period, the devil became the predominant god of these witches. And this devil had nothing in common with the devil of the Bible.
No, nothing whatsoever.
This devil was someone who promised you powers, promised you magic, promised you whatever it is you wanted, basically, for service to him. He had horns most of the time.
He was Pan.
You know, black, red, appeared as different animals, just like the old gods. I think it's pretty obvious that this began to either represent a pre-Christian god or an idea of a pre-Christian god, or somebody took it, somehow culture took it in a different direction. Because if you were going to go off the Christian belief, you'd say an angel descended before them.
Yeah.
You know, it would be something else. You know,
or a dragon.
Yeah.
You know, like in Revelation, like you could take it there. Not a goat.
I think that the devil of the witches is completely different from the devil of Christianity, because it has a blueprint of pre-Christian belief in there, regardless of how it got in there. Most of the mystery cults were associated with horned gods, whether it was Dionysus, who was seen as a bull, or a ram at times through Bacchus.
White bull, yeah. Thrice horned.
You know, the Apis bull for Osiris. Serapis was seen as a bull and a ram.
And the golden ram of Khnum and all that.
Amun Serapis and Amun Zeus went throughout Europe as a ram-horned god. Serapis having a pitchfork in his hand.
Alexander took him everywhere.
You know, so, and the emperors, the cult of Isis.
Absolutely.
So you have this, the Krampus festival's going on today, the Puck Fair in Kilkenny. You've got this idea that there is this sort of, the rural gods seemed to often be associated with horned animals.
The hunt, yeah. I agree.
Or agriculture.
And you're right, that is the devil that became the devil of the witches. Candy is saying, okay, so yes, Diana, but why would, if you're a witch, why would you believe in Lucifer the devil? That's all Christian. Diana, she says, appeals to my European roots, but not the devil. I'm not
that Lucifer is obviously conflated with Apollo,
yes.
his twin brother.
Here's something I've said a lot in this show.
And because she had been, sorry, I've just got to get
You're fine.
My belief is that kind of idea of Diana. All of a sudden, Apollo and Diana were never seen as lovers in classical mythology. However, you've got, not that I know of anyway.
No.
However, all of a sudden there's this incestual relationship going on between Diana and the sun.
Yeah.
Where does that sound, what sounds familiar about that?
I know.
Diana had become conflated with Isis, and in the Icean mysteries in Egypt, brothers and sisters often kind of familiar.
Fairy flowers in the attic, just saying.
So the idea that comes from the Egypt mystery cults is that, you know, keeping it in the family was not so strange. I think what you get with Lucifer is you're getting either a secret name for Apollo, or you're getting a conflation between this devil of the witches and an old icon. I don't know the answer. We don't know the exact answer, but it does appear. I don't think of Lucifer as
Satan,
as the fallen angel of the Bible.
No.
I think of Lucifer as light.
Same, the light bearer. I think of him as, I think it's a reference to the planet. I think it has a lot of planetary correspondences. It does in the oldest documents, where Lucifer is the morning star and it's Venus and whatnot is seen in the dawn, which was had a deep religious significance astrologically to a lot of ancient cultures. I am going to say something that I think might not be popular, and I don't know if Brian will agree with me at all. He probably won't. And it's to Candy's comment about, I don't want all this Christian, to be vulgar, I don't want all this Christian shit in my witchcraft.
And you don't have to have it. It's like, choose your time frame.
This is where I disagree. Witchcraft is a product of Christendom. It does not exist outside of it. If you are, if it
I know where you're going with this, but you might want to articulate it.
Here's what I mean. Before Christianity, we would not have been witches. We would have been priests in a mystery cult. Isis, Eleusis, Bacchus, Samothrace, take your choice. If you are going to draw from the history of witchcraft, you are going to have to realize that Christianity plays into it. Also, if you believe that you are really experiencing the mysteries of God, which I actually do believe we do, I'm a believer in this. You know, I am a priest, I am an initiate, this is not a hobby. You know, I believe I am engaging in the ancient mysteries, as silly as that may sound to some. I cannot say that Christianity does not have a spark of that as well. And here's why. The mysteries are bigger than my religion. And I'm going to say something that might seem controversial to other initiates. Our religion will eventually die. They all do. Eleusis is ruins. I've been there. You know, it doesn't matter to me. The mysteries will never die. So I do not have some sort of knee-jerk need to hate on some Christian element within my religion, because the mysteries are eternal. They're bigger. developing a relationship with the gods and with divinity and with the mysteries means you are going to have to stop thinking parochially. Like, that's why I love that we're able to pull
We
from
make
lots
assumptions
of thoughts.
sometimes, and I'm only catching this because one of the people helping editing my book had a question, and I think we take it for granted. We say it all the time. I'm going to clarify, even though it's not the subject. What do we mean by the mysteries?
Yeah, good point.
People don't necessarily know. The mysteries are philosophies, concepts, secret teachings, often through story or ritual, that have been consistently passed down throughout human culture, often from one culture to the next. And this generally has occurred through priesthoods. However, in the dawn of Christianity, sometimes this happened through academia as well. So it's this idea that these sort of sacred stories and processes are going on. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the information that we believe has been carried on in a form of storytelling, oral tradition,
Yes.
and ritual experience, because it is something you have to experience the mysteries. You can't just tell someone the mysteries. We believe it's been going on and it's been passed on throughout human civilization, and we believe it's alive and well today. We believe witchcraft predates Christianity, but it wasn't called witchcraft then.
Exactly.
So what Levi's saying is that a lot of the imagery, we don't know for sure that the word witch, doesn't have stronger pre-Christian origins, but the reality of the situation is it pops up in the English language, which is, really not much of a pre-Christian language.
Yeah, it's not.
And it pops up in Old English, and it pops up in the Germanic, and in the Germanic, it certainly does have older roots. However, there's no proof that those words were ever a formal religious movement of any meaning. Doesn't mean it wasn't.
Yes.
We just don't know. However, what we're practicing today is really a conglomeration of whatever survived. And if something was going on during Christianity, it was the same thing with less accessibility. People who couldn't read and write, people who had to invent it from their imagination or whatever was given to them. I do believe certain families and aristocrats carried on mystery cults throughout the whole thing.
Sure. I will go further and say this. What do I mean by the mysteries? Okay. The word mystery comes from Latin via Greek, mystes. I actually have a tattoo with it on it, which meant initiate. That's literally what it means. If you were an initiate into the cult of Bacchus or an initiate into Eleusis, you were called a mystus, right? That's what you were. You were a Mysterian. Now, here's the difference between the mystery cult and the state cult. The state cult really told you that you are what you are. You're a cog in the wheel. We pray to the gods because they help us win wars and they make the crops grow. And when you die, you go to the underworld. That's that. Too bad, right? Only kings go to heaven. In Babylon, for example, in Babylonian mythology, I was just reading this recently, everybody went to the same gloomy underworld except for the king, and he went to be with the gods or whatever. The mystery cult was about bringing God into man, right? The gods were immanent. They were not transcendent necessarily. You could become like the gods. That is what the mysteries are, is I am not some pawn in a state cult. I am a divine figure. There's no part of me that is not of the gods. That is part of our liturgy, and that comes from the mystery cults. So that's what we mean by the mysteries. Anybody who has decided this mundane existence is not enough for me. I wish to be divine, right? I wish to be like unto the gods. And that is the birth of the mysteries. And the state cult will never give it to you.
So I wanted to address, can't see your name now, Candy. This actually has come up quite a few times. The reality of the situation is there were lots of mystery cults, pre-Christian priesthoods that existed. They just didn't call themselves witches at that point in time. They would have been called witches by the church.
By the church, yeah.
If you took priests and priestesses of Isis, and I'm not talking about the huge Isis Roman cult that I connect with so deeply, but even in ancient Egypt, they fit the bill of witchcraft 100%. They were male, they were female, they were initiated, they were the magicians, the magical people. If you wanted healing, you went to the temple of Isis.
They kept the amulets and all that.
If you wanted a love spell, you went to the temple of Isis. If you were an ancient Egyptian, that's the way it was. They were the witches. Those priests were trained in magic. The Druids are just another pre-Christian priesthood. However, a Celtic one, the people we would call Celts. Druid is actually an English word, so they didn't call themselves Druids.
The Druid or whatever in Welsh,
Druid,
Druid.
And there were millions of different Gaelic names for this caste. Unfortunately, they were not exterminated by the Christians. They were exterminated by other pagans, namely the Romans.
Oh yeah, Claudius hated them.
I do believe they survived in Celtic culture, and there were probably initiates who scattered throughout Britain and taught what they knew to other people.
In the bardic tradition,
but by the time Christianity and English came into being, Gaelic was on its way out. Unfortunately, that priesthood was killed off. We now have people who are reconstructing what little we know about them, which most of it comes from Julius Caesar and monks, honestly.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're calling themselves Druids, and they're trying to reconstruct that. The Druids of Stonehenge that you see from the early 1930s onwards, they were just Masons who dressed up. They weren't. It really hurts a lot of people's feelings to say that. I wish they would have survived. It's kind of like when the Jedis get exterminated, I'm sure a few of them got out of Anglesey, but unfortunately the campaign to destroy that priesthood started before the Christian religion even mattered. So unfortunately there was a lot of persecution there. If Druidry survived, I believe they probably were later on identified as witches or cunning folk.
Or I think you get that heavy, I think the fairy faith and the Celtic versions of Christianity
Celtic magic survived into the modern era on some level.
But literal Druidry, no, it died.
The horseshoe, four-leaf clovers, all that sort of, leaving ribbons on fairy trees, the festivals that are going on there are all remnants to the beliefs that the Druids once oversaw. However, when's the last time you heard about bulls getting their throat cut underneath oak while the mistletoe was being gathered with a golden sickle? Stopped happening a long time ago.
Also, there's so much about Druidry that's just bad. I mean, bad history. So, for example, was the mistletoe was their most sacred thing? Okay, well, it doesn't grow in some of the places that the Celtic people had Druids, and that's a much later, So it's a very murky history. And
well, a lot of that would have come from Gaul, wouldn't it?
Exactly, it's a very murky history. And
it's fine. Yeah. I mean, I'm very Celtic. I believe in that magic. There are lots of things we can draw on. The
mythology.
I love the Ogham information. I love the Mabinogi. I love the myths. Witchcraft is highly influenced by the Celts. Modern witchcraft is highly influenced by the Celts.
Celtic mythology.
It's one of the cultures we draw upon. Legends. However, as a priesthood, it's just simply didn't survive. And I had someone in my class trying to tell me that it did, and I couldn't just sit there and say, oh, yeah, it's like saying the Earth's flat. Sorry, guys, it's not.
It's like it did.
Wish it would have. But here's the thing that matters. We're all gathering together our practices now, and we're free to do it again. Mm-hmm. So, to the person's statement earlier, you don't have to exist within Christianity. You can go back to pre-Christian peoples and be inspired by them. And the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans wrote a lot down, and we have vast amounts of magical information left by those ancient peoples. Unfortunately, the Celts did not write a lot down.
Yeah. Well, they were forbidden to. The Druids were forbidden from writing.
That's what they say.
That's what they say. Candy is saying, she's coming back, with a comment and saying, she realizes that it's disconnected, right? Like, she's not saying that it's continuous. She's just saying that she wants to keep the heritage alive, which I can understand.
Well, it is there.
Yeah,
you go to, you go, like I was saying earlier, there are sites still being worked in Britain. Gaelic is still being spoken. Those gods are still being worshipped, what we know about them. Mm-hmm. Witches and modern day pagans and druids are worshipping the old gods of the people that we call Celts. I worship Celtic gods. I worship, in Celtic ways and folk customs, and I work with the she still. It's not the only way in which I work, because I am not a Celt. I am not pretending to be a Celt. I'm not trying to be a Celt, but it certainly is a part of my physical heritage and magical heritage.
Sure. My mother's maiden name is Conley, and it was originally O'Connelly. So I've got it too. But one of the things that I want to say is, I agree with what you're saying, Candy. You're saying, like, of course it's not, continuous, but I want to keep it alive. But you use a word that I'm a little hesitant sometimes, which is reconstruction or reconstructing. If
that could also be called making up,
which
isn't bad
not
necessarily.
But even further than that, you're not actually reconstructing it, because I can promise that you're not slitting the throats of white bulls over grates and and things like that. If you read, like, for example,
inspired by might be a better
Walter Burkitt he wrote a book called Greek Religion. It's one of the best academic surveys of Greek religion, of the state called. There is no such thing in the ancient Greek religion of worshiping one of the gods without animal sacrifice. So, are you doing that? I highly doubt it. And even if you are, it's not the way they were doing it. You might kill a chicken or two or whatever in some traditions, but you're not doing what they did, which is elaborate altars, the burning of the fat, the keeping of the bones. It was a whole thing.
Well, this is the other thing
you're
you
not
need to
doing
remember.
that.
Is when we're talking about Europe, right? You've got the migrating Indo-European peoples, right? They all came together in this great migration. I'm sure there were people already there, but you had the Italians, the Greeks, the people we call the Celts, the Germans. These were all the same wave of tribes settling into different parts of Europe, and they all originally, most of them had a common root language group, right?
Yeah, Indo-European.
So the people we now call the Celts migrated from, they believe now, I think it's sort of a little north of India.
The Indo-Aryan invasions and all that,
yeah. They come from the east, So this division that a lot of people want to create is a very modern idea. That's why I'm a mystery priest. I don't draw from one particular culture. I am not trying to be like, I am Irish, my gods must be Irish, everything I do must be Irish. That's not me. I think it's become a very popular idea. It was also very popular in a place called Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
So I think it's very dangerous, and I don't think that our ancestors thought that way. I don't think the Celts interchanged with the Germans, they interchanged with the Romans, they interchanged with the Greeks, and probably the Egyptians, and these people would share their gods and their ideas about gods, and it was not a problem. So this idea of isolating faith and religion to a culture is very modern.
The only requirement to be initiated to Lucis was that you could speak Greek, so you could understand.
So you could understand the ritual.
That's it.
And likewise, if you were doing a Gaelic ritual, you need to be able to understand.
I think there might have been some other weird ones about eunuchs and whatnot, but the big thing was that you could not. You just had to speak Greek.
The religion of the Celts was an initiatory mystery cult that we now call the Druids, and you had to be initiated into it to be that
years
priesthood
of training.
Who was overseeing the tribes.
Years of training.
Doesn't exist anymore. And no one's been initiated into it because it went extinct.
Yeah.
So
I'm totally for pulling from the past.
Doesn't mean you can't be in an order now.
Sure, no, I'm not.
There's orders of druids now that are reinitiating people and doing it again.
Bring it alive.
They've reconstructed it. And some of them have done a pretty good job. Not anti.
No, not anti at all.
I'm anti the delusion of a woman sitting in my class saying, you should talk to a real druid.
Well, they're all
my
dead.
teacher's Welsh. She's from Wales.
Yeah, it's like they know.
Go back to Tennessee.
So yeah, Christopher says something. The first thing we teach newcomers to our grove is that we have no direct historical connection to the ancient druids. And Obod, which is one of the biggest druid orders, is very clear about that. They say it
but
openly.
They do have a cool occult history.
They do. I love it. But they say very openly, we are a renewal, right? We're not a direct line.
Now, the festival's going on in Wales, the Gorsedd or whatever, I think has a little bit more of a history to it.
It's bardic, right?
Yeah, which is connected.
I do think the bardic tradition in the Celtic lands kept a lot of druidical lore alive. I do believe
through
that.
song and story.
So somebody did ask an interesting question. They were talking about their Native American heritage, and they said, your opinions about Native beliefs in witchcraft, are they the same or are they different? I will answer my opinion, which is witchcraft is European. It is a European invention. Not invention, but it's a European phenomena, I should say.
All religion is a human invention, so you're not wrong.
Yes, but it's a European phenomenon, right? So I'm sure there are similarities in terms that we both honor the earth, we both honor the agricultural cycle. I know that from a lot of Native American spiritual beliefs. Life after death. I mean, there's lots of things that are probably similar, but beyond that, I couldn't speak to it because I'm not Native American.
There are some similarities. I grew up with a Native American family who I'm still friends with the young lady that was my closest friend in that family. I haven't spoken to her in a long time. She'll tell me off next time I do. But they were very into their customs, in their tribal spirituality, and had worked with medicine people. And, you know, I learned a lot, like shamans, not a word they would ever use.
No, it's
they
from
said
Central Asia.
medicine people is what they would say in our language. They had their own words for it. They did speak their native tongue. They were also a little bit Catholic, you know, so it's the first time I had giant Mary statues with freaking eagle claw hanging around her neck.
Love that.
And feathers and stuff.
Love.
You know, which you see that in Catholicism, in, you know, Irish Catholicism, you know, Spanish Catholicism, Italian Catholicism, but most people haven't witnessed it with Native Americans, and I have.
They
so
do, yeah. A lot of evangelical Christians too.
There are similarities in the sense that they become involved more intimately. They've got their sort of form of nature connection, and but it is very different in the sense that witchcraft, whether it's you want to consider it pre-Christian, or whether you want to consider it something that came up in Christianity in the medieval period, or whether you want to consider it a modern cult, all have the same things in common. They're a priesthood, they're a cult. Whether you were being initiated to the Lucis or by the Druids, or whether you were being initiated by the devil at the crossroads at the Witches' Sabbath, or whether you were being initiated in the New Forest by Edith Woodford Grimes.
Yeah.
This idea that it was a cult and it's got a very European flavoring is extremely different than other magical practices. A person who is bringing cream up to a sacred rock and tying a ribbon around a fairy tree is performing some form of folk magic, but that doesn't make it witchcraft, necessarily. Witchcraft has always had this one thing in common, that it is a form of religio magic and had some sort of community aspect to it.
Yeah.
That's in all the stories.
All of them.
You know,
there's no
from
secular
all
witches
three phases we're going to.
Period, or the
you
Renaissance.
know, and if you look to the pre-Christian
exist.
magical religious people in pre-Christianity, they were always initiates of some sort of mystery cult. Even Medea was considered a priestess, you know, which in that culture indicated she was initiated. You were not a priestess in Greek, Roman, Egyptian cultures unless you were initiated
in the mystery cults,
into one of the mystery cults.
In those areas.
It just was the way it is.
The state cult had priests, but not the same thing.
You know, I definitely, you know, it's once again, what are we talking about with witchcraft? Of course, the church, a lot of people think, oh, you know, if you cast a spell, they would call you witch and burn you. That's not actually how it worked. The church was actually extremely lenient on folk magic and magic. They sold it themselves.
Yes,
they did not kill people for doing magic.
No.
They killed people because they were making pacts or stepping outside of the realm of Christianity. The accusation that you were practicing witchcraft meant you were worshiping something else. Whether it was Diana or whether it was the devil, and the church used both of those things.
Or the Lady of the East, or the Queen of the Fae, or the dead, or whatever.
You were not
Jesus.
Burnt to the stake or hung because you tied a ribbon around a fairy tree.
Or did a horoscope.
If that was true, the May Day festivals wouldn't have had a continuity that goes on to this day. Fairy trees never stopped happening, and they weren't killing people in Ireland for fairy trees.
Carlo brings this up, Ginsburg brings this up, and so do lots of scholars. There were punishments for magic in a lot of places. It was a slap on the wrist, or sometimes they got serious. It was like 40 days fasting on bread and water or whatever if you caught doing serious horoscopes or whatever. But they weren't going to kill you. You know, they were not going to kill you. Agrippa was forced to recant. He wasn't murdered, you know, because he was still a Christian. If you were a witch, it meant you were something else. And there was always a religious connotation. Now, somebody mentioned, and it was Sinalias, said, they're right, witchcraft does not come from family connections. Yes, that's true. Even in the mythology.
Unless that family is initiating.
If you read the trial records, you did have mothers and daughters being killed together and stuff like that a lot, but or almost never, I shouldn't say never because there are a few, but the vast majority of historical witchcraft documents do not consider it a lineage thing in terms of blood. It is a pact made by the individual, right? Initiating into something larger than themselves. So this idea that my family passed down the witchcraft, well, that's weird because it's not in the history at all. It's not really not part of it. It's not part of the mythology.
In any of the histories.
It's not part of the mythology.
You don't find that. However, families did pass down magic.
Yes, magic,
and
absolutely.
Most people are talking about that. What we're trying to get across is that regardless of when you look at history, whether it's pre-Christian, during Christianity, or after Christianity, it was never seen as some sort of family hereditary.
No.
Where that myth starts to come about is partially due to some of those early witches, including Gerald Gardner and Alexander's, promoting this idea that it was kept in families. But they were saying it was kept alive in certain families, and it was. I believe that initiations were kept alive in certain families. I just believe most of those families were aristocrats who were capable of educating and hiding and concealing their activities. There is so much proof from things like Masonry to the early occult orders to the Hellfire Club throughout Europe of secret cults going on within wealthy families. Because what is the name? I know this is an early period, but that Egyptian family that hid underground temples.
I forget their name, but they built the catacombs in Alexandria. They were the last one of the last families that practiced the Egyptian religion, and they built catacombs in the old faith underneath Alexandria after it had become Christian for quite some time, and the Serapeum was destroyed and everything under the bishop. So it did keep alive.
The people who are most capable of hiding a secret would have been that
Well, they had power.
We know of popes that were practicing occultism. No one who's going to call them out.
Yeah. So something I want to say, and again, I'm not trying to pick on anyone here whatsoever.
No, we're not at all. Yeah.
But there are so many comments on here that I've not addressed that are like, I'm from Norway and I'm from blah blah blah, and I have to honor my ancestors. Okay, first of all, your ancestors were Lutheran for a very long time. Okay, so I guess screw those ancestors. You know what I mean? Like, I guess they don't
Which
matter.
ancestors?
If you're saying I'm honoring my gods of my ancestors, well then you should be Christian, because if you're going to go back far enough to find your pagan ancestors, we're probably related. That's how genetics works.
Yeah.
You're
and
too
you
far
might
back.
be in a different country.
And you might be in a totally different country with totally different gods. Because, just because your ancestors were in Norway 300 years
There's
ago doesn't mean they
wrong
were there 1,000
with
years ago.
exploring your culture. I think that I think what we are trying to say is that has nothing to do with witchcraft.
That is exactly what I'm saying.
Witchcraft has never been put
racial.
forward as a racial religion.
No.
And, from our perspective, we believe in reincarnation. So did the Druids. We believe in initiation, the mystery sort of thing. So it doesn't,
Here, can I say what I think sociologically is happening here? To take it to a more academic place for a sec. People have written about this. This obsession with my ancestors.
It's a lack of identity that we currently have.
Exactly. We're in a postmodern world. We killed God. Nietzsche said, after the death of God, we're not Christians anymore. We don't have the church to unify as Western Christendom is dead. So we're not a unified culture anymore, and so people are desperate for an identity. So this idea of I am this, and it's been this way for thousands of years. First of all, okay, I get why you want that in a postmodern watery way.
I love how he's the mean girl today, and I'm like, it's okay if you do.
I'm so not into it, because first of all, let me warn you.
There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not witchcraft in itself.
Also, it's BS. You're not 100% anything.
No.
It doesn't exist.
We all come from Africa.
We do originally. There is no racial purity.
Or some land that's sunk under the sea.
And I think it's dangerous to tie your religion so strongly, especially in Western European contexts.
Unless you are actually connected to tribal
culture,
you are not in a tribe. And tribes are the only place where I think it's okay to be racial.
No, take for example.
In other words, the Native American who's actually connected to the Navajo tribe,
yes,
by a lot of blood,
or
that makes sense to me that they're trying to keep that alive. But when you're talking about, Germany, this is a big country. Do you really need to keep your German racial heritage alive? There's nothing wrong with keeping cultural customs alive.
So again, be Lutheran if you want to do that.
It's scary to think that that's the reason someone would worship God. I don't worship my gods because I think I have to.
Exactly. Very good point.
I
want to.
I'm American, so I must worship the Statue of Liberty, or I'm letting my culture die.
Also, Heather says something that is 100% true. As somebody I lived abroad for a while, Heather says it's such an American cultural thing to do. It is. Americans are obsessed with ancestry. Do you know in France DNA tests are illegal? They're illegal.
In France?
They're illegal. You can't, like DNA and ancestry and whatnot.
Weird.
You don't do them. And also asking people racial and ethnic questions on national surveys like the census is illegal. You know, this is a very American thing to be like, I live outside of Ireland, but somehow I'm Irish. Like, Irish people think that's weird. You know, if you were born and raised in Chicago and your family's been there for 3 generations, I get that you consider yourself Irish Catholic, but fun fact, most Irish people don't. You know, you're not Irish to them.
Well, here's where I'll give you
American.
guys a little bit of hope. I'm just strange enough to where I honestly think that I am part fairy, and it comes out my eyes turn green.
Okay, we're just gonna just gonna
ask Christine. It's true.
It's fine. It's fine. He also tells me he's the son of Aphrodite. He's Egyptian. There's a lot of things going on here.
I am part Egyptian.
I'm sure you are, baby. We all are, you know.
No, actually, what it is that there's Ancestry.com's obviously had a reboot, which disturbed a lot of people because I'm actually glad they did it because Ancestry.com, it's proving that they're going along with advances in the science.
Yeah.
You know, that they're like, well, we didn't know this 10 years ago. This is a very quickly moving thing. However, doing one of those isn't where you get the information. You've got to go through multiple sources. So that's where I found out. Really, it's the migration pattern.
Sure, I'll give you that.
We all come from Africa, and a lot of people who are of Caucasian descent are probably going to originate in the eastern provinces of Africa.
Yes.
Which is where...
Here's something I want to say real quick, though, that I wanted to address a minute ago and I let slip. Brian said something about being a member of the tribe and that being okay. Yes, and let me be very specific here. It actually angers me when someone compares their reconstructed Western European pagan religion like Asatru or whatever, or Celtic Reconstructionism, to Santeria, for example, right? There's a massive frickin' difference. First of all, Santeria is an unbroken tradition, right? That was brought over, that was an amalgamation of Catholicism with Yoruba traditions and West African traditions. Those people's ancestors worshipped those gods, right? The Orishas in Santeria, the Loa and Haitian Voodoo were incarnations of African gods that were ancestral gods that were literally worshipped by these people continuously. They might have been hidden as saints or whatever, but nobody worshipped Thor for a very long time until it was reconstructed. So,
yes, but you're wrong when it comes to like Brigid.
Brigid, sure. That's a
there
different
are
thing.
Examples.
But that's a different thing. What I'm saying, though, is it's still, the analogy still holds. Mm-hmm. There is not a continuous priesthood. There is not a continuous anything. And there is a nasty tradition in the West, I'm sorry, of those tribal ideas being tied to fascism. And I mean, it is just there. I'm sorry. And I know it sucks for you
me,
people
it
who
just
aren't
isn't
into
a part of my belief system.
But it's just problematic.
I think that this planet has come to a point to where why can't we just realize we're all human beings? And that, the reason my skin is this light is because my ancestors got a vitamin K deficiency. Not because we're a different species.
No,
And, at the end of the day, all of our magical ancestors worked with plants, objects, animals, spoken words, gods. They all had solstices and equinoxes because it's that way all over the entire planet.
Yeah.
They all recognized the sun, the moon, and the earth because we're all in the same place. They all had the elements because we all have the elements. At the end of the day, there's nothing new under the sun. So I actually do agree with that. I think that it's all okay. It's all fine. If you're drawn to your ancestral heritage, that's great. Just don't make that your moving factor. If everything about you is because you're black, you're white, you're Chinese, you've got your own issues to work out, in my opinion.
Well, I will add this.
I'm not saying you can't celebrate those things about yourself.
Sure.
But that's where it gets dangerous.
There is a difference.
Who gets to do that and who doesn't?
Here's the thing.
And where? Because here we would say that we have the, what do they call it? The privilege.
Yeah.
But that's not true throughout the world.
No, it's not.
If I stick Levi's white butt in Japan, he's no longer going to have that privilege necessarily.
No. Of having that freedom.
They don't necessarily like.
Here's the big difference. I am gonna be a little bit less open here. Because I believe firmly in certain, sort of social just as ideas. I do, regardless of whether or not, and I'm not doing this to be politically correct. I'm doing this because it's important to me.
We're totally politically correct individuals.
I'm not on most things, but on one thing I am, and it's not
my job today, which is very bizarre.
I'm not politically correct at all, but I will say this. Do not compare the suffering of your pagan ancestors to the suffering of practitioners of ATRs and whatnot. Here's why. Your pagan ancestors are about 8 millennia away, and you have no idea you were actually related to them. You just don't. And if you go that far back, we're all related. Okay, you're going so far back that there's no even real connection, right? When a black Cuban is talking about the suffering of their ancestors, it's a couple generations ago, okay? Or in the case of segregation and stuff like that, it's their parents, right? So do not make that assumption, okay? It's very tacky.
I think that the issue that we get is that, unfortunately, Europeans were the first to fall to Christianity, but we fell so long ago, that we've lost a lot of that identity, and we wish we had it.
Yeah.
We wish all of that wouldn't have happened. I don't know about you, but I drive down the street, see all these ugly churches, and say, "Can we just have one goddamn great temple? Can we have nice things anymore?"
Especially when they're all Protestants. I'm sorry. Catholicism just prettier.
Catholicism is prettier, Greek Orthodox, but
very beautiful.
It's boring. We want that identity, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I've only played oppressed when I was a teenager towards Christians who were trying to oppress me.
Well, we are gay.
I've never tried to play oppressed with other religious movements.
No.
Nowadays, I don't play oppressed to anyone because I would rather be the oppressor. Give me
We're coming for you.
I will throw Christians in the Colosseum again before I...
No, and I know what I'm saying is not super popular right now, and I get it. I'm not trying to be controversial. I'm just saying, I get very eye-rolly when somebody talks about the suffering of their ancestors and their frickin' Bavarian.
We've got to wrap it up. So, as usual, we never scratch the surface of what the actual topic is. I think that the mythology of witchcraft is valuable because parts of it probably have a historical accuracy, in the sense that every legend and myth usually has some sort of truths behind it. It's about filtering those truths. You've got to do that for yourself. Regardless, that mythology has impacted modern witchcraft in some way. And we are a living, breathing mystery cult that is alive and well today. Okay. We're born not only out of these mythologies, but Western occultism, and the different lands in which we are all inspired from. Next week, we are going to do something that's very out of the box for us. We're going to do a show called Getting Started, because we're often talking about, our expertise or different various topics that might appeal to initiates, and that is the theme of the show. However, we want to talk about not only how you could get started, but what's the truth about us? How did we really get started? We might be sharing some of the tea with y'all, and I'm getting a little New Orleans-y there. And we might even have a special guest with dirt.
We just might. So for my little ending, I'll say this. Because I did take it way off topic into that whole weird rant about your ancestors. Sorry. But it went a little weird. Here's what I'll say about witchcraft history. We really, there's an ambulance in the background. Thank you, French Quarter. There are 3 things.
I like what Eden said there. Don't mix religion with tradition. Very good. Like that.
They're not the same thing.
Don't mix your drinks.
I think we're pulling, in witchcraft history, what's important? What do we actually believe in? What are we using as modern initiates of a mystery cult? Here's the 3 things that I think are the most important. Number 1.
Wine.
Big fan. Wine, sex, and drugs. No.
I was going to say wine, sex, and power.
You know what? It's fine. I love about that too. Number 1, we are pulling from the history of initiatory religion, which is very old. And it's not just in the West. You have it in Tantra in the East. You have it in a lot of places. But it's this idea that you can become one with God. You can become one with the divine through your own personal power and through that power coming down to you. It is as above, so below. If that's, that's a thing in the ancient world. And we love that. So it's agricultural based in a lot of places because that's what we understand in nature. So we're pulling from that. That's step 1. Step 2, we are pulling from the Western occult tradition, which happened in Christendom. This is Kabbalah and philosophy and elementalism and all that, and Pythagoreanism, and it's awesome because it gives us this amazing intellectual basis.
Salvaging of the classical
world. Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. We're salvaging classical intelligence, classical academia. And the third thing is what we talked about a lot today, the Sabbath, which you need a little of, the sexuality, the rebellion, the desire for power and freedom and liberation. That is what it means to go into the woods and worship something besides the church, right? You want to be free, right? You shall be free in your rights. That is what we're here for. So that's what we're pulling from that mythos. And all together, you mix that together and you get initiatory witchcraft and the modern revival of it, which I think is both ancient and new.
And working towards, we're not there yet, but we're working towards estimated at least 100 years of continuity.
Yes, a century.
Since we can trace its origins to the 30s, but assuming that this thing was formulating before the new Forest Coven, it may be longer than that.
And the mysteries must always be renewed. They're always eternal. If you really believe that this stuff is real, and you really believe in initiation in the mystery cult, then it is going to be constantly renewed. To pull something from the Christians, one of my favorite Christian works is the Confessions of St. Augustine. He was a prick, but it's a beautiful work. And he has
We've both sworn once in this.
I know, right? He's got a great line that's very famous where he says, because he converted late in life, he says to God, "Late have I loved you, O love both ancient and new," right? And he's acknowledging something that we acknowledge, which is, it is both ancient and new. We are a renewal. We are a revival. We are not continuous, but it doesn't matter because the mysteries are. They're eternal.
Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Witchcraft Mythology and
I know.
Insanity.
And yelling at you about your ancestors.
And you're just wrong.
You're all wrong. God
Levi's just got a lot of things going on right now, you guys, to know.
I'm going to get a talk about
adopted.
this later.
He's adopted and he's mad about it.
I'm not adopted.
He's Jewish.
I'm not Jewish.
But anyway, good night. Next week we're going to have hopefully a surprise special guest. And we're going to talk about how to get started in witchcraft and how we did.
How we did, right?
The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Kidding.
All right.
See you guys later.
There were covens in Europe. That's what they're called. The congregation.
Like
covens in Europe, in America, and in Australia, and they have one right here. That whole bunch. The parties with the singing and the flute and the chanting. Those are espas or sabbats or whatever they're called.
Excited, huh?
Read what they do, guys. They use blood in their rituals, and the blood that has the most power is baby's blood.
We need to get some